Hello, and welcome back. Tonight, let everything slow down a little. Let your shoulders soften, and allow your breathing to flow more evenly, more slowly, more lightly. Out there, the world may still be lit up, still busy, still full of sounds that have not yet had the chance to settle. But right now, here, we are going to step away from the present for a little while and make our way toward a city that once shone brightly in the land of the ancient rivers. Tonight, we are going to Babylon. Not the Babylon of vague rumors, nor only the Babylon of ruined walls and legends told and retold across thousands of years, but Babylon as a place that truly once lived, truly once breathed, truly once echoed with the sound of footsteps upon sun-warmed fired brick. A city where the gates opened before caravans of traders, where cooking smoke drifted upward from low rooftops, where scribes bent over clay tablets, where prayers rose from the temples, and where the night sky was watched with eyes filled with both reverence and wonder. We will not simply stand at a distance and gaze at Babylon as if it were only a name in a history book. We will step inside it. We will walk its streets, pause in the marketplace, enter a house, listen to the rhythm of ordinary lives, and slowly feel how that city once moved, once functioned, once endured. So before we begin, tell me where you are listening from, or whether the place where you are sitting now is wrapped in a quiet evening, or in a night still filled with sound. And if you love these gentle, unhurried journeys into history, then stay here with me. Now, let us step through the gates of ancient Babylon together and see what life there was really like. Now, as the night has grown a little quieter, try to imagine that before you there is no longer the familiar room, but a land vast, flat, and so ancient that its memory seems to have been preserved in the dust itself. There are no great mountains holding the horizon in their embrace, no deep forests thick enough to block the eye. There is only the plain stretching far away, bands of yellow-brown earth, quiet canals, and the Euphrates flowing through like a steadfast vein of water nourishing an entire world. Upon that land, long before the greatest empires of the West had even taken shape, human beings had learned to live by the rhythm of the river, to wait for the flood season, to raise embankments, to guide the current, and to transform a place that might have seemed dry and unyielding into the cradle of cities. Law, temples, and power. And there, in the middle of that plain, Babylon slowly begins to appear, not all at once, not as some overwhelming wonder that stuns the eye in the very first instant. Babylon reveals itself more slowly than that, as many ancient cities often did to travelers approaching from afar. First comes the sense that there is something unusual along the horizon. Then, within the pale light of early morning, you begin to see straight lines that nature does not make for itself, the edges of walls, the masses of gates, sections of architecture rising above the level ground around them, and the unmistakable feeling that what lies ahead is no longer open plain, but a place where human beings have gathered their strength, ambition, faith, and fear together in order to build a center that could be mistaken for nowhere else. Babylon was not the first city of Mesopotamia when its name first began to be known. it was not yet the heart of an entire world. There had already been older cities, centers that had once been more splendid, traditions of rule and worship rooted deep in history. But Babylon possessed a strange quality that many great cities share. It knew how to wait for its time. It stood in a position favorable enough not to be forgotten, close enough to the arteries of river travel to be tied to trade, warfare, and territorial control, yet flexible enough to rise when older orders began to tremble. That city did not appear like a miracle. It grew gradually as an answer shaped by geography, by politics, and by the human desire to set a center amid the land of the rivers. If you stand for a long while at a distance, still far enough to take in the whole view, perhaps the first thing that makes you understand why Babylon could become a great power lies not in beauty, but in logic, in a land where water is life. Whoever controls the waterways, the arable land, and the routes between inhabited centers holds more than food. That person holds the breathing rhythm of the entire region. And Babylon, set beside the Euphrates, was not merely a place where people built houses. It was a knot, a gathering point, a place through which goods, news, commands, soldiers, merchants, pilgrims, and caravans passed, leaving behind some portion of the world's weight upon its soil. That is why, from being a city not the oldest, Babylon gradually learned how to become the city others had to look toward. There had been kings before it, capitals before it, but Babylon slowly created for itself a different kind of radiance, the radiance of a place ascending. Under the first dynasties that lifted it beyond the scale of a regional center, the city began to bind its name to organized power, to law, to the ability to gather land and people into a larger order. And then, through many centuries of upheaval, contested, threatened, wounded, Babylon still did not vanish. That, too, tells us something important. This place was not strong only because of its walls. It was strong because the idea of itself had grown large enough. People continued to want to hold Babylon, to restore Babylon, to possess Babylon, because whoever held this city was also holding a symbol of legitimacy and majesty. The road leading you to Babylon does not pass through some romantic landscape of fairy tales about deserts and golden palaces. It passes over packed earth, low grass, branches of water, wheel tracks, and the footprints of caravans that came before. The morning air carries the smell of river mud and the last trace of dampness before the heat of day descends upon the ground. In the distance, the city grows larger with every step. The walls are no longer dim streaks, but heavy, solid masses, bearing the feeling of structures built not to delight the eye from afar, but to mark the boundary between inside and outside, between what is protected and the uncertain expanse of the world beyond. We often imagine ancient cities as places that grew naturally, as if people simply kept adding houses until a city formed. But Babylon, at least in its most brilliant period, was not merely a settlement that expanded over time. It was a declaration made in fired brick, its layered walls, great gates, straight roads, and ceremonial courts reveal a remarkably powerful urban imagination. Someone had thought not only about living here, but about how this place should appear before the eyes of others. Babylon was not built merely to shelter. It was built to impress, to organize power, to elevate a god, a king, an empire, and the city itself into a position worthy of its ambition. And then, once you come close enough, Babylon begins to change from a single mass into details. The walls emerge with the heaviness of their material and the firmness of their lines. You can imagine the early sunlight touching the brick surface, not making it blaze like marble, but turning it warm, smooth, and subdued. This is not a cold beauty. It is the beauty of earth taken from the plain, kneaded by human hands, fired, stacked, and transformed into structures capable of standing against wind, sun, and war. There is something deeply Babylonian in that. This city was born from the very substance of the land around it. Yet once completed, it rose above its humble origin to become something almost symbolic. Perhaps nowhere does that appear more clearly than at its gates. Let your steps slow a little here. Before you stands an entrance not made simply to pass through. It was created to make passing through into an experience. A city gate is not merely an opening in a wall. It is the moment when a city tells you who it is. In Babylon, that was especially true. This city, above all in its greatest period under large-scale building campaigns, did not want to be seen only as rich and powerful. It wanted to be seen as a place protected by the gods, a place where power had taken on visible form, a place where architecture and symbol moved together. If you arrive while the sun is still low, you can imagine the glazed surfaces of the great gate beginning to gather light before the rest of the city has fully awakened into brightness. That blue is not the color of the distant sky, but a color intentionally placed by human hands into architecture, so that the gate seems to wear a skin wholly unlike the yellow-brown plain around it. Across its surface move rows of sacred beasts, orderly yet alive, as though the wall itself were not still at all, but carried within it a procession of beings belonging to the divine world. All of this makes the entrance to Babylon feel like more than safety. It feels solemn. You have not yet stepped fully inside, and already you understand that beyond that gate lies an order larger, sterner, and more meaningful than the drifting life of the fields beyond. To pass through that gate is also to step into a city built, broken, repaired, expanded, and reimagined across many generations. The Babylon people remember most vividly was not the product of a single moment. It was the result of many layers of time laid over one another. There was the Babylon of the early rulers who first raised it onto the map of power. There was the Babylon of the periods when it had to endure pressure from other empires. There was the Babylon that suffered deep wounds and yet was raised again as a declaration that this city had not yet spoken its final word. And then there was the Babylon of its height, when it seemed almost rewritten through architecture, when ceremonial roads were made worthy of sacred processions and imperial proclamations, when walls and temples together told a story of strength. If you listen closely enough, you can almost feel that even within the silence of imagination, Babylon does not resemble a city that suddenly sprang up in empty land. It resembles a place that has absorbed too much time, every layer of brick, every section of wall, every shift in planning feels like one sentence laid over the sentence before it. This city is not innocent. It carries the memory of having had to endure amid rivalry, ambition, and collapse. Perhaps that is precisely why Babylon's majesty does not feel fragile. It is not the beauty of something never tested. It is the beauty of something tested many times and still determined to stand higher. From the gate, the road leading inward toward the center seems to pull your gaze straight toward the city's heart. This is not yet the moment to linger over houses, marketplaces, or the ordinary patterns of daily life. What matters now is the feeling of space. Babylon knew how to make those entering. It understood that they were approaching a center with rank and order. Nothing is laid out chaotically. There is direction. There is axis. There is guidance. The city seems to take hold of your steps and say, "Keep going. Look upward. Remember that this place was not made by accident." And then, somewhere ahead, rising above the horizontal lines of the walls and rooftops, you can imagine taller masses of architecture standing in quiet presence. Temples, great courts, centers of ritual and power. They do not yet need to be explained to make an impression. Their very presence is enough to tell you that Babylon was not a city built merely for dwelling. It was a stage for sacred power and earthly power, a place where human beings wished not only to live, but to affirm their place within the order of earth, sky, and history. There is something very beautiful in thinking of Babylon this way, that in the midst of a plain that seemed flat and endless, human beings decided to create a place with symbolic height. They could not make mountains, so they built structures high enough to force the human eye upward. They could not make the river change course at will, but they learned how to organize life around its flow and turn it into an advantage. They could not stop time from destroying all things. Yet they built as though their works deserved to be remembered longer than a single lifetime. And in that effort, Babylon became more than a city. It became a human answer to the vastness and uncertainty of the world. Perhaps that is why the name Babylon has endured so long in human memory. Not only because it was once rich, not only because it was once powerful, but because, in the imagination of so many generations, Babylon represents the moment when human beings gathered enough strength to create a center that was both real and symbolic, a place one could touch by hand, and yet a place that made people think of things greater than themselves: order, divinity, ambition, pride, and the price of wanting to stand at the center. Tonight, we have only just arrived in Babylon. We have only stood before it, entered it, and begun to understand why this city could rise from the mud along the riverbank to become one of the greatest names of the ancient world. We have not yet touched all the layers of life waiting within it. We have not yet heard all its sounds. We have not yet seen all the faces, the hands, the anxieties, and the faith that made it a city truly alive. But perhaps that is enough for now, because sometimes, in order to understand an ancient place, we do not need to know everything about it all at once. We only need to come near, only need to stand before the gate, only need to feel the wind blowing in from the plain, the river still flowing somewhere nearby, and before us Babylon, revealing itself slowly in the first light of day, growing larger, clearer, solemn, majestic, as though it had been waiting for us for a very long time. Once you have passed through the city gates and allowed that first feeling of awe to settle, Babylon begins to reveal itself in another way. It is no longer only a city of massive walls, majestic gateways, or the impression of a place built to astonish the world. Now, as you move deeper inside, it gradually becomes something closer, warmer, more human. A place where life does not unfold in an endless chain of grand moments, but through thousands of small acts repeated every day, quiet yet enduring, like water flowing through canals. Imagine that the morning has only just grown a little brighter. The early sunlight is still gentle, not yet pouring fire onto the earth. Along the lanes between rows of mud brick houses, the city wakes not with one single sound, but with many small sounds layered upon one another. There is the sound of early footsteps on hardened ground, the opening of doors, the clink of objects touching in a small courtyard. Brief, familiar calls exchanged by people who have lived close enough together that they do not need to raise their voices. Somewhere, cooking smoke begins to rise, thin and pale blue in the morning air, and little by little, Babylon is no longer just a name in the imagination. It becomes a real morning. Most of the city's inhabitants did not live in the monumental structures that later generations would remember most vividly. They lived in low houses built from the most familiar materials of this land: clay, mud, reeds, wood, and whatever else could be gathered from the river plain. Thick walls helped keep some of the summer heat at bay. Many houses turned inward, arranged around a small courtyard where light poured down at midday, where people worked, cooked, washed, dried clothes, repaired household objects, and lived the most ordinary hours of their lives. From the outside, those houses may have looked rather modest and closed. The walls facing the street usually required little opening or decoration. Babylon was not the kind of city that displayed its private life outwardly. It kept what was familiar and intimate inside the courtyard, behind pale brown earthen walls that had absorbed sunlight year after year. But once you imagine stepping inside such a house, a whole small world begins to appear. A corner where jars of grain are stored, a place for tools, mats, low stools, pottery vessels. The light does not enter as something too bright or overwhelming, but falls in soft patches upon the ground. That space may be simple, but it is not lifeless. It bears the marks of hands, of habits, of tasks repeated every day so many times that they themselves begin to create a feeling of safety. If you look more closely, you will see that Babylon was a city shaped by the rhythm of family life. Morning did not begin with lofty ideas of empire, but with the need to light the fire, prepare food, fetch water, and arrange the labor of the day. In the end, urban life in the ancient world was always sustained by such simple things. Before anyone could think of palaces, temples, or long-distance trade, someone had to knead dough, someone had to bake bread, someone had to keep watch over the household stores, someone had to mend a basket, tie a cord, sweep the courtyard, and prepare for the growing heat as the sun climbed higher. In the air of Babylon, the smell of food was an essential part of life. Not first the scent of lavish banquets, but the smell of what sustained the many. Think of bread baking in a clay oven, that warm, dense smell, so fundamental, so ancient, almost universal wherever human beings have settled. Bread, in many forms, was the foundation of the meal. Alongside it was beer, but not as something imagined as a pleasure separate from daily existence. It was closer than that, more practical, more intimate, present as part of the very ration of life. Then there were onions, garlic, vegetables, dates, sometimes milk, oil, fish from the river or the canals, and meat in those circumstances where it was not always reserved for every ordinary meal. And so, if one truly wishes to understand Babylon, perhaps one should not look upward first. One should not focus only on what is highest, most beautiful, most striking. One should look at a bowl, a loaf of bread, a jar of beer, a person carrying a basket along the road, or a flower-covered hand in the early light. That is where the city begins to become real. An empire may be remembered for conquest and architecture, but a city can exist only if each day it manages to feed its people. Babylon, however magnificent, also had to awaken from that very practical place. As the sun rises higher, the roads begin to fill. There are narrow lanes between rows of houses where the shade leans across the ground, only briefly before disappearing. There are wider routes where people and goods move in steady streams. The city is not still. It moves constantly, yet not with the hurried motion of a modern metropolis. It has its own rhythm, as though everything were already accustomed to the weight of sunlight, the flood season, the roads, and the tasks that needed doing. People did not run by the clock. They moved according to necessity. Somewhere near the main thoroughfares, the market and the areas of exchange begin to come fully alive. One can imagine sacks of grain, baskets of dates, jars of oil, pottery vessels, textiles, tools, wood, metal, and countless small goods that a large city needs in order to sustain daily life. The air in such places is thicker, louder, more crowded with smells. Dust is stirred up beneath the feet of people and animals. Goods are stacked in heaps and rows, examined, weighed, considered, carried away, shifted from place to place. Babylon was not merely a place where people lived. It was a place of circulation. The city survived because everything passed through other hands before reaching the place where it was needed. There is a beauty all its own in the commercial life of the ancient world. It has none of the polished gleam of glass storefronts or bright signs. It is far closer to material substance. In Babylon, you can almost feel with your eyes the weight of goods. A sack of grain is not just an object. It is the labor of the harvest, of irrigation, of work in the fields. A piece of cloth is not merely something to wear. It is time, the hands that wove it, the raw materials processed through many stages. A jar is not simply a container. It is earth dug up, kneaded, shaped, fired, and brought into use. Everything contains labor within it. And, for that reason, if you watch it long enough, the market of Babylon is not merely a place of buying and selling. It is a place where the city reveals its whole body. Beside those who exchanged goods were those who created them. Babylon could not be Babylon without its large class of laborers and artisans, people whose names often did not survive, though the marks of their hands were everywhere. There were potters, turning wet clay beneath their palms to make jars, bowls, and vessels. There were brickmakers, repeating nearly endless motions with mud, molds, and sunlight. There were woodworkers, repairing tool handles, patching frames, rebuilding doors. There were those who spun thread, wove cloth, cut, tied, folded, and arranged. There were people who worked with metal, leather, and reeds. A great city is not built only by decisions made from above. It is kept standing by the skill of very particular hands. And those hands worked in an atmosphere very different from the romantic image we often have of the past. Babylon was beautiful, but it was also hot, dusty, heavy, and demanding of endurance. By midday, heat began to gather on house walls, on the ground, in courtyards without shade. The light grew harsher. The air shimmered above heat-soaked surfaces. The movements of the city changed with it. People sought shade wherever they could. Small moments of pause became precious. In household courtyards, beneath awnings, against thick walls still holding a little coolness. Life slowed for a moment before continuing on. Those midday hours allow us to feel more clearly the structure of Babylon as a place where people had to know how to live with the climate. This city did not entirely resist its environment. It adapted thick walls, inward-facing spaces, the organization of work according to the hours of the day, the use of wind and shade. All of it speaks to that. The ingenuity of Babylon's people lay not only in great and monumental things, but also in knowing how to make a day pass under conditions that were never easy. If you were to walk through a residential quarter at that hour, you would likely see life separating into many layers. Here, someone is still working on an unfinished object. There, a simple meal is being prepared. A child stands in the doorway looking out at the road. An older person sits leaned against a wall, quieter than those still busy around them. A group carrying goods passes more slowly than it did in the morning. The sounds have not disappeared, but they have softened, as though the whole city were yielding for a while to the weight of the sun. Then, as the heat begins to slip past the height of day, Babylon shifts once more. The roads seem to come alive again. Unfinished work is taken up where it was left. Trade, transport, repair, craft, the preparation of the evening meal, all return to their steady rhythm. A great city has no right to stop altogether. It can only loosen and tighten, slow and continue, like the deep breathing of a giant body. And perhaps the most memorable thing here is not any single detail, but the overall feeling of how Babylon was sustained by ordinary things. History often tempts us to look at what is exceptional, striking, and grand, but if you stand long enough amid the life of this city, you begin to understand that what kept Babylon alive from one day to the next was repetition. The repetition of breakfast being prepared, the repetition of bread being baked, the repetition of goods being carried, the repetition of courtyards being swept, water jars being fetched, ovens being lit, baskets being woven, cloth being made, containers being patched, and roads being crossed by people who never imagined that they were making history. They were simply living, and yet they were the greater part of Babylon. And perhaps that is precisely why this city, when seen through the layer of everyday life, suddenly feels much closer to us than its grandeur does. Because beneath all the distances of time, material, language, and belief, we still recognize things that are deeply familiar: a family organized around a meal, a day divided by labor and weather, the need for water, for shade, for food, for exchange, for repair, for stability. These things do not make Babylon any less magnificent. On the contrary, they give its magnificence the ground on which to stand. The greater a city is, the more it depends upon small things to support it. As evening slowly falls, the light of Babylon begins to change. The earthen walls no longer glare, but grow softer, warmer, almost dark gold beneath the final sunlight of the day. Dust becomes more visible in the air. The rooftops, passageways, and courtyards seem to slow within that light that makes everything less sharp-edged. This may be the hour when the city is most beautiful in its own way, not the beauty of ritual, but the beauty of a day drawing to its close after having completed the work that needed doing. In many houses, the evening meal is prepared. Familiar objects return to their proper places. People gather more closely together after the day's labor. The sounds of daylight grow less scattered, less directed toward the road, and draw inward toward the family, toward the meal, toward a more intimate rhythm of life. At this hour, Babylon no longer bears so much the appearance of a great center operating before the eyes of the world. It becomes again a gathering of countless rooftops, countless courtyards, countless small meals taking place all at once as darkness slowly climbs the walls. And if you stand still for a moment within that imagined scene, you will feel clearly that life in Babylon was not upheld by extraordinary moments occurring every day. It was sustained by the endurance of very ordinary people. They were the ones who carried water, kneaded dough, lit fires, bore goods, mended tools, wove cloth, fired pottery, swept courtyards, prepared the evening meal, and woke the next morning to do nearly the same things once again. It is that repetition that gives the city its depth. For when a place can repeat life across enough days, enough seasons, enough generations, it is no longer merely somewhere people dwell. It becomes a world. And that is perhaps the truest way to see Babylon at the level nearest to human beings, not merely as a name, a power, or a symbol, but as a city of meals, courtyards, markets, labor, heat, rough but skillfully used materials, and all the tasks that must be done before dark. A city where, if you move through it slowly, you will see that what keeps it alive does not lie in what stands highest, but in all that is low and near, in the earth, in human hands, in cooking smoke, in footsteps along a dusty road, and in the quiet continuation of an ordinary day. Tonight, we have remained with Babylon only in the rhythm of its daily life. We have passed through its houses, hearths, food, markets, and labor, and felt that this city was not only ruled, but truly lived, and perhaps that is the gentlest thing an ancient city can show us, that before it became a memory of history, it too was once simply a place where people woke, lived out a day, and then let darkness settle over earthen rooftops, while another day waited just ahead. Once we have passed through Babylon's dusty roads, household courtyards, hearth fires, water jars, and the repeated rhythms of its daily life, we begin to feel that this city was held together not only by labor, but also by invisible bonds. There were things that did not rise immediately before the eye, like walls or marketplaces, and yet slipped into nearly every corner of existence. Promises, obligations, ownership, safeguards, the fear of losing what one possessed, the desire to keep one's family from slipping out of the order that had already been established. In Babylon, private life did not stand apart from the law. It lived alongside it, moved through it, and was often shaped by it in its most intimate forms. Imagine a morning not very different from the others in the city, but instead of pausing over kitchen smoke or the sound of footsteps outside, we step into a room where the air feels quieter. It may be a corner of someone's home, or a space connected with record-keeping and witness. On the low surface before us lies a clay tablet, still soft. A scribe sits leaning slightly forward, a reed stylus in his hand. Around him are a few people who do not speak much. They have not come here to buy and sell some simple object from the market, but to give something in their lives a clearer form, something confirmed, bound, and remembered. A marriage, a loan, a transfer of property, a commitment between one person and another, but one that does not wish to rest on memory alone. This is one of the things that makes Babylon appear so vividly before us. This city left behind not only walls and temple towers, but traces of private life. People made demands of one another, entered agreements, disputed, promised, and protected themselves against an uncertain future by turning spoken words into writing, by turning agreements into objects that could be held in the hand and brought out for comparison when matters no longer passed peacefully. There is something profoundly human in that. For even in a distant, ancient world, people still feared the uncertainty of tomorrow. They understood that today might be harmonious, and tomorrow might bring conflict. And so, they wrote, in Babylon, family was not merely the place of affection, it was also the basic unit of social order. When thinking of family in such a city, one should not think only of the warmth of an evening meal or a shared roof. One should think of it as a structure of duties, roles, succession, inheritance, responsibility for support, and also the possibility of fracture. Family was where children were born, protected, and raised. But family was also where property was preserved or lost, where honor was guarded or damaged, where decisions about marriage could alter the standing of an entire line of people. And so, marriage in Babylon was not merely a matter of private feeling between two individuals. It was bound up with house, wealth, responsibility, and the recognition of the community. One can imagine a wedding not carrying only an air of joy, but also within it the seriousness of an arrangement, two families facing one another, terms being spoken aloud, valuable goods prepared, bridal gifts, dowry, property brought into the union, responsibilities toward the wife, toward future children, toward the household that would be founded or sustained. Feeling may have been present here, but it was never the only part. Babylon was a society too deeply bound to structure for marriage to be no more than a passing emotion. That is precisely why law entered so deeply into family life. It did not appear only in cases of major crime or grave dispute. It was present even in questions very close to the heart. Who owned what? Who was obliged to provide for whom? What happened if a pledge was broken? What standing a wife held within a marriage? How children were protected? How property was passed on? Of course, this was not an equal world in the modern sense. It was a hierarchical society, one in which power leaned toward men, and its asymmetries were unmistakable. Yet it is precisely within that inequality that we can see more clearly why the Babylonians needed recognized rules. In a society where so much could depend on status, the existence of law and written documents did not make everything perfect, but at the very least it gave power a more visible form. If you were to stand inside a Babylonian household on an ordinary day, you could feel those threads moving quietly through it. The father, or the head of the household, was not merely the oldest man in the house. He was the point of connection between that home and the outer world of property, duty, and legal standing. The mother was not only the one who kept the rhythm of domestic life, but might also be directly tied to the property brought into the marriage, to her position in her husband's household, to the safety of her children. Children were not only joy or the continuation of bloodline, but also the future of the family name, of inheritance, of labor, of who would care for whom when old age drew near in such a world. Affection and interest were not neatly separated. They coiled into one another, making every family decision at once intimate and heavy. Then, beside marriage and inheritance, there was debt, something perhaps quieter than war, yet deeply influential in the daily life of many people. Debt in Babylon was not merely a matter for wealthy speculators or great merchants. It could touch ordinary people, touch the harvest, touch the question of food for the coming year, touch families that needed only one bad season or one disruption in the household to begin wavering. Imagine a year when the water arrived at the wrong time, or some unexpected expense arose, or the stored reserves were no longer enough. In such moments, borrowing became a way to carry a family through a difficult stretch. A little silver, a quantity of barley, a promise to repay after the harvest, a pledge sealed with a mark, with witnesses, with a clay tablet dried hard. From that point of view, debt was not always a sign of failure. It was part of a living economy. It allowed present needs to cling to the hope of the future. But because that hope did not always become reality, debt also carried a darkness of its own. Today, one borrows to survive hardship, and tomorrow one may be able to repay if all goes well. But what if it does not? What if the next harvest is still poor? What if illness comes? What if the herd diminishes? What if the household's main worker is no longer strong enough? Then the loan is no longer a temporary bridge. It becomes a cord tightening slowly around a family. Perhaps nothing brings Babylonian life closer to us than that feeling. One need not live in a modern age to understand the anxiety of debt. To be human, to know what it means to depend upon tomorrow, is enough in Babylon. That anxiety appears with startling reality. A man sitting in silence for longer after returning home. Not because of bodily exhaustion, but because he is calculating what he will have when the day of repayment arrives. A woman counting the remaining food, without saying a word aloud. yet already knowing in her mind how far it will or will not stretch. A family telling itself that if next season is only a little better, they will be all right, while inwardly understanding that life rarely obeys such simple prayers. And because debt could reach so deeply into survival itself, the law had to reach into it as well. Babylon was a world where loan agreements were recorded clearly, where the lender wanted protection, where the borrower wanted to know the limits and conditions, where disputes might arise from numbers that seemed dry on the surface and yet contained the full weight of a family's fate. When you look at a clay tablet recording a loan, you are seeing more than a few lines of symbols. You are seeing the tension between present and future, between trust and fear, between the possibility of survival and the risk of decline. All of this also made the scribe a very unusual figure in Babylonian life. He was not a warrior, not a king, not a priest, yet his hand could preserve a marriage, a debt, a dispute, an acknowledgement of adoption, a pledge of provision, a division of property. He turned the fragility of speech into something that could be confronted and tested. And once a written document existed, private life was no longer completely private. It had been drawn closer to the order of the city. It could be recalled, used as evidence, invoked when human memory began to lean in the direction most favorable to itself. Perhaps this is one of Babylon's deepest qualities. It was not only a place where people lived, but a place where they learned how to give their lives a record. A child was recognized not only through affection, but through registration. A wife was protected not only by a promise, but by terms already set down. A lender relied not only on another person's honor, but on documents, witnesses, and seals. A separation was not merely an outburst of anger, but could lead to the need to redefine property, duties, and the position of each person. In that sense, Babylon was a city in which family life had already entered the light of procedure. But one should not therefore imagine everything as cold as a machine. Law here did not strip human life of feeling. On the contrary, it shows us how strong human feeling was. So strong that society had to build frameworks to keep it from shattering too much. Behind a dispute over property, there may have been hurt. Behind a marriage contract, hope. Behind a debt, shame, worry, or the determination to save a family from a season of hunger. Behind an inheritance agreement, an entire story about who was loved more, who was trusted more, who had been left at the outer edge of the shared household. Law recorded the outward structure of life. But if one looks closely, one still sees within it the human heart, filled with old anxieties that belong to every age. There must have been nights in Babylon marked by the weariness of families struggling to keep everything from falling apart. After the evening meal, when the city had grown quieter, perhaps someone remained sitting beside a small lamp, thinking of the clay tablet lying somewhere as a stern reminder that the day of repayment was drawing near. Perhaps a mother watched her child asleep and thought of the meager property she wished to preserve for them. Perhaps a newly married couple carried in their hearts both joy and the feeling that they had just stepped into an order larger than themselves. Perhaps brothers and sisters within one household had already begun to understand, without speaking it plainly, that when their parents were gone one day, dividing the shares would not be gentle as it had been in days of greater plenty. It is in those moments that Babylon ceases to be merely an ancient city. It becomes a place where human beings confront the most familiar questions of organized life. How to love without surrendering one's rights. How to preserve wealth without destroying a family. How to save oneself from hardship without being dragged deeper under by debt. How to make a promise given today still hold value when hearts change over the years. These questions are neither more modern nor more ancient than one another. They are simply the questions of human beings who live close enough together to require law, yet remain full enough of desire and fear that law can never become something distant. If you walk slowly through Babylon with all of this in mind, you begin to understand that law here was not simply punishment. It was an effort to keep the city from dissolving into countless desires, colliding against one another. It told the people that marriage was not only the concern of two individuals. Debt was not only the matter of two purses of wealth. Family was not only a private place with its doors shut. All of it belonged to a larger network, where common order demanded that every promise take on shape, every right have a boundary, and every dispute have some way to be judged. And yet, no matter how tight that framework was, it did not erase the fragility of life. The Babylonians likely understood that more clearly than anyone. They lived on a land where harvest depended upon water, where stability depended upon power, where family depended upon too many small things all going right at once. For that very reason, law was not a sign of absolute certainty. It was a response to uncertainty. It was the way human beings built fences around the things they feared losing most. And perhaps that is the image to keep as we leave this chapter. Not a king proclaiming law from on high, important though that is, but a small clay tablet lying in the shade of a room, marked with orderly wedges recording an agreement that looks very ordinary. A marriage, a loan, a share of inheritance, a commitment between human beings trying to keep their lives from being swept away by forgetting, by dispute, by risk, by unannounced change. Babylon, at this deeper level, was not only the city of great gates and ceremonial roads, it was also the city of families trying to protect one another, of promises pressed into clay before they hardened, of debt slipping into meals and sleep, of law entering all the way into the house itself. And it is there, between the very private and the very public, between affection and obligation, between hope and constraint, that we begin to see an ancient city in its true depth, not as a distant symbol, but as a world where people loved, worried, made agreements, preserved what they could, and feared losing everything they called home. Once we have passed the low rooftops, the dusty roads, the simple meals, the clay tablets of debt, and the quiet obligations that keep Babylonian life from slipping out of order, we begin to feel that this city is upheld by a deeper layer still, a layer that cannot be held in the hand like bread or silver, and yet is present everywhere, from the city gates to the smallest house. It is the world of the gods. In Babylon, the divine does not dwell in some distant place removed from daily life. The gods do not appear only in rare hours of prayer. nor merely in stories told to children after nightfall. They are present in the very order of the city, in the way temples are built, in the roads set aside for ritual, in the great festivals that alter the breathing rhythm of the whole city, in the belief that the king's power does not stand alone, and in the profound sense that between human beings and one another, between human beings and the land, between the city and the sky, greater forces are still present. If you were to stand in Babylon on a very quiet morning, before the sounds of market life and labor rose to fill the streets, you would perhaps feel this more clearly than ever. The air at that hour still carries a rare coolness before the heat of the day. The light has not yet turned harsh, but only just begun to touch the fired brick surfaces, so that the city seems to be waking slowly from blue-gray shadow into pale gold. And against that dawn, the sacred buildings do not appear as ornaments of Babylon. They appear as its heart. A temple in Babylon is not merely a place where people stop, bow their heads, and leave. It is a space where the divine is made present within the city. It is where prayer, offerings, incense, ritual, and authority meet. If an ordinary house holds the rhythm of a family, then the temple holds the rhythm of the community at a higher level. There, the order of the city is joined to sacred order. People do not come only to ask. They come to sustain a relationship. For in the Babylonian way of thinking, the gods are not abstract ideas. They are real presences, beings with will and power, capable of protection, capable of anger, capable of blessing, but also capable of letting human beings drift into chaos if the city forgets its obligations. And among this world of gods, Babylon has one deity who stands more centrally than all the rest: Marduk. That name is not only the name of a god honored in a great temple, it is like a heartbeat pulsing beneath the whole city. As Babylon rose into the center of power, Marduk rose with it. The city and its god reflected one another. The greater Babylon became. The more brightly Marduk shone within the sacred order, and the more supreme Marduk became in the religious imagination, the more reason Babylon had to see itself not merely as a powerful city, but as a place set at the center of a larger order. Imagine yourself following a road that leads gradually into the sacred district of the city. The ground beneath your feet may already have been packed firm by countless travelers before you. On either side rise walls larger, more solemn, no longer bearing the modest privacy of ordinary residential quarters. Even the air seems to change. Fewer cries of buying and selling, fewer small sounds of daily routine. In their place comes the feeling of a place where one steps naturally slow, not because anyone forces you to, but because everything around you compels you to understand that this is no longer the most ordinary part of Babylon. In places like this, architecture begins to do the work that words no longer need to do. It teaches people how to feel reverence. The courtyards are wider, the walls higher, the entrances arranged so that the one who walks in cannot forget where he is going. Babylon understood the power of space. One may use words to describe a god as exalted, but when a structure makes you lift your eyes, lower your voice, and feel yourself grow smaller between heavy, quiet masses of architecture, then the divine has already been spoken through brick and emptiness. And then, somewhere within that sacred landscape. The Temple of Marduk appears as a point of gathering. Do not imagine it as only a large chamber. Imagine it as a world of layers, of gates, of courtyards, of rooms, of places set aside for ritual, of areas only certain people may enter, of chambers where sacred objects are kept, and of the invisible yet unmistakable presence of ceremony. In such spaces, light always seems different. It is no longer the light of the street. It is interrupted, measured, allowed to fall in chosen places, making every movement feel more deliberate. Even the scents are different there. Perhaps the smell of incense, of oil, of cloth, of wood, of things that have remained in the temple long enough to absorb a particular kind of silence. The Babylonians did not worship their gods only in thought. They worshiped them through action, and it is precisely here that their religious world becomes so vivid. The gods were tended as real presences, given offerings, served in ritual, placed at the center of a regular system of devotion. There is something deeply striking in that way of thinking. It does not make the gods more distant, but nearer in a manner full of majesty. The gods do not dwell only in the heavens. They have a place in the city. They have temples. They have attendants. They have feast days. They have roads along which they pass in great rites. They have a role in keeping Babylon truly Babylon. And if you lift your eyes higher still, another form begins to rise above the flatness of the city, the ziggurat, in a plain that is otherwise so level. Such a tiered structure must have made an overwhelming impression. It is not merely a great building, it is a refusal to remain flat upon the earth. In a world where nature had not given Babylon sacred mountains, human beings built a mountain of their own kind, one tier set upon another, rising higher, clearer, like a gesture reaching from the earth toward the sky by means of architecture, by day. The ziggurat must have appeared firm and severe in the sunlight, its steps and walls catching the light in a way that made it both majestic and somewhat austere. Yet, in the gentler hours of the day, especially at dawn or in the late afternoon, it may have taken on an almost otherworldly quality, not because it was vague, but because it was so unlike everything around it. Houses remained low, markets stretched horizontally along the ground. Even courtyards and walls, however large, still mostly spread outward, but the ziggurat rose. That rising alone was already a declaration. It said that Babylon was not content merely to organize the earth. This city wished also to send a sign upward into the sky. Perhaps that is also why, when standing before the greatest sacred structures of Babylon, people would not have felt only reverence. They would also have felt themselves to be inside a city that always wanted to make its order visible. The king had his palace. The people had their quarters. Goods had their market. Law had its clay tablets. And the gods had their temples, and those towering forms large enough to ensure that no one could forget where this city placed its faith. But religion in Babylon does not live only in brick, in courtyards, or in the height of great buildings. It lives most powerfully when the city enters ritual. Try to imagine an ordinary day suddenly becoming something else. From early morning, there is already a feeling of expectation in the air. People prepare not only for their usual work, but for something greater than work. The major roads are watched more carefully. Places already solemn become even more intentional. People gather, eyes turn towards a certain axis of space. The city is no longer merely functioning. It is waiting for a rite to begin. On great occasions, such as the New Year, Babylon could become an immense sacred stage. Not a stage in any artificial sense, but in the sense that every part of the city is awakened into its symbolic role. The processional road is no longer merely a road. It becomes the path through which God, power, and the faith of the community appear together before the eyes of all. The gate is no longer merely architecture. It becomes the threshold of a collective experience. The temple is no longer simply a place of prayer. It becomes the point from which a sacred order begins to spread through the whole city. You can imagine a procession moving slowly and in order, the sound of footsteps, the rustle of cloth, perhaps ritual music, chants, prayers, the sounds of ceremonies repeated for so long that they have become the backbone of the city's memory. And on either side of the road, those who witness are not merely spectators. They are participating by their very presence. For a great ritual never belongs only to those performing it. It belongs to the shared feeling that the city is being restored to its rightful place in the eyes of the gods. And in all of this, Marduk is not merely the god being praised. He is the center around which the entire city turns in that sacred moment. Babylon looks to Marduk in order to understand itself. A great city needs an image of order. It needs a point of reference that does not lie solely in political power. And Marduk provides that in him. Babylon sees the legitimacy of its central place, sees protection, sees the hope that chaos may yet be driven back so that the world may continue to function as it should. And if we pause here for a moment, we begin to notice something deeply significant. The Babylonians did not worship only out of fear. They worshipped because they lived in a fragile world. Rivers could change their rhythm. Harvests could fail. Illness could come. Debt could tighten its hold. Power could change hands. War could arrive from distant lands in such a world. Having gods was not merely a spiritual comfort. It was a way of preventing reality itself from becoming total disorder. If the gods were still there, if the rites were still performed, if the temples still stood firm, then the city could still believe it had not been abandoned. That is why the temples of Babylon did not stand apart from daily life. They were connected to meals, to harvests, to the hope of fertility, to the fear of plague, to the longing for protection on journeys, to the wish that the city might remain at peace. The people who passed through the temple courtyards were not always stern figures of authority. They may have been very ordinary people, carrying in their hearts prayers not unlike the timeless concerns of humanity everywhere. May the children remain healthy. May the next season be kinder. May business not fail. May the family not be torn apart. May the anxiety gnawing at the mind grow a little softer. At that level, Babylon suddenly feels much nearer, even if their gods bore names unfamiliar to us, even if their temples stood in a world lost long ago. The gesture of looking upward towards something greater than oneself is not unfamiliar at all. Human beings everywhere, in every age, have done the same, when their own strength was not enough to secure tomorrow. They looked beyond themselves. Babylon did the same. The difference is only that here, an entire city was built so that this upward gaze might take on a more radiant and enduring form. As evening falls upon the sacred buildings, Babylon must have taken on an entirely different beauty. Sunlight slants across the high walls, stretching long shadows over the courtyards. Fired brick deepens into warm, subdued color. The spaces seem wider in the growing quiet of the day's end. If in the morning the temples suggest a place waking alongside the city, then in late afternoon they seem like something that had already stood there long before the day's activity began, and will still be there when the final sounds of the day fade away. Perhaps at such an hour, when the light begins to weaken, looking up at the ziggurat would carry an almost enchanted feeling, not because people did not understand that it was made by human hands, but because in the twilight, the line between material and symbol seems to blur slightly. It is both brick and idea, both architecture and spiritual ambition. It belongs both to Babylon of clay and labor, and to Babylon of gods and cosmic order. And then night comes, yet the temple does not vanish. The sounds around it may diminish, the courtyards may grow emptier, the gates quieter, but its presence in the mind of the city remains. Babylon may sink into darkness, but the gods do not therefore leave its order. Perhaps somewhere in the night, small lamps still burn, prayers are still whispered, people still believe that the peace of tomorrow cannot rest on human strength alone. If one had to keep a single image from this chapter, perhaps it would be not merely the great temple or the ziggurat rising from the plain, but the whole feeling that Babylon was a city living beneath the gaze of the gods, a city in which religion was not a coating spread over the surface, but something lying deep within its structure, in the orientation of its roads, in the festivals that altered the rhythm of the whole city, in the conviction that the city was truly itself only so long as the gods were still honored, the rites still continued, and sacred order had not yet been broken. At this level, Babylon was not only a place where human beings built houses and traded goods, it was a place where they tried to live in such a way that the world above and the world beneath their feet remained connected. A place where faith became space, became road, became brick wall, became song within ritual, became the height of a structure that forced the human eye to lift. And for that reason, when we pass through the temples and walk beneath the shadow of the Babylonian gods, we do not see only an ancient religion. We see the deep human effort to place fragile life within an order larger, more solemn, and enduring enough to resist the fear that everything might one day dissolve into chaos. Once we have passed the low rooftops of ordinary people, the clay tablets bearing written pledges, and the temples where the gods were present within the city, we begin to feel that Babylon possessed yet another layer, broader, heavier, and a little colder. It was the layer of power, not power as a vague idea, but as something with the form of walls, palaces, armies, commands, tribute, and columns of people who went forth and did not return as they once were. Babylon was not merely a living city, it was the heart of an empire, and a heart like that could not beat on faith or trade alone. it beat through control. If you were standing at a place high enough to look out over several parts of Babylon at once, you would probably understand that immediately. This city was not built like some accidental shelter. It had axes, gates, and spaces clearly organized to remind everyone that a true center of power existed here. The closer one moved toward the areas tied to royalty and the machinery of rule, the more unmistakable that feeling became. The buildings grew larger, the walls thicker, the entrances more closely guarded, and the very air seemed to change. If the residential quarters carried the feeling of daily repetition, then Babylon's zones of power carried the feeling of decision. There, things were not merely done, they were handed down. Imagine yourself walking along a broad road leading toward the palace. This place no longer bears the intimacy of household courtyards or the familiar murmur of the marketplace. Space opens with greater intention. Everything seems arranged so that the one approaching can feel the difference between himself and the place ahead. The walls are not high only for defense. They are high to create distance. Great courtyards are not there only to be used. They are there to display scale. The gates do not merely mark passageways. They mark the boundary between where people live and where they are ruled. In the imagination of many generations, the Palace of Babylon often appears as the center of luxury, and certainly, splendor was there. But if we see the palace only as the king's splendid residence, we miss something more essential. The palace was the material face of state power. There, authority was made into space. The great chambers, the courtyards opening one after another, the decorated walls, the many-layered gateways. All of it existed not only for beauty, it created the sense that the ruler there was not simply a man. He was the point from which the order of an entire territory was issued. Within those spaces, the king's words were no longer ordinary speech. They became commands that could send an army marching out, begin a monumental project, subdue another city, uproot a population, or turn an entire land into a source of grain and tribute for Babylon. Perhaps that is what gives imperial power its two faces. From afar, it may look like the light of glory, but from close enough, one sees that it always comes with a weight that others must bear. Babylon did not become a great center merely by standing in the right place on the map. This city grew through war, through the collapse of rivals, through periods of threat and recovery, through a desire not simply to endure, but to dominate. The empires of this region never stood still for long. They competed for trade routes, fertile lands, strategic cities, and the loyalty of dependent territories. And Babylon, in order to keep its place, could not merely be beautiful or rich. It had to be strong enough that others, when looking toward it, knew that behind those walls lay the power to punish. If you imagine a morning near the city gates, not the morning of ordinary people beginning household work, but the morning of an army preparing to depart, Babylon would appear very different. The air would carry a special tension. People and animals would move with unmistakable purpose. Weapons, carts, supplies, clipped orders, heavy footsteps, all of it would gather into a rhythm no longer belonging to ordinary life. An imperial city cannot be separated from the military. even if life inside the city continues through hearths and markets. At its edge, there is always the possibility of stepping outward to conquer, crush rebellion, or force distant lands to remember that Babylon stands above them in the order of power. And yet the strength of an empire does not lie only in whom it can defeat. It also lies in whether it can turn victory into lasting structure. And Babylon, in its greatest age, did exactly that in many ways. It collected tribute, it amassed wealth, it drew resources from other lands to nourish its own heart, which means that behind the brilliance of glazed walls, great gates, and ceremonial roads, there were also invisible streams of silver, grain, wood, stone, livestock, precious goods, and human labor flowing in from many directions. A brightly colored brick in Babylon may have been the work of hands within the city itself, but it may also have carried within it the mark of an entire network of power stretching far beyond the horizon. A banquet in the palace, a full storehouse, an immense building project. None of these were sustained only by the city's internal strength. They were sustained because Babylon had learned how to make other places serve its radiance. And that is when the dark side of empire begins to show itself more clearly. We are often too easily softened by Babylon's beauty. It is all too easy to look at its blue-glazed gates, its immense walls, its ceremonial avenues, and feel that this place belongs only to art, religion, and the grandeur of human imagination. But every beautiful empire has its price. Behind such magnificence lies hard labor, concentrated wealth, communities placed under control, and lands stripped of their resources so that one center may shine more brightly. Babylon was no exception to that rule. It too was a machine that drew weight from elsewhere in order to enrich itself. Perhaps no image reveals this more deeply than the columns of people driven away after war. Imagine another city, somewhere far off, just defeated. Its gates have been opened, its walls proven useless, its leaders subdued. But after that event, nothing truly ends. Very much begins instead, and in a far more painful way, property is inventoried. The old order dismantled, part of the population forced to leave its homeland. They walk roads they did not choose, toward strange lands, not knowing what use their lives will now be put to. For empire, this is strategy. For human beings, it is uprooting. Babylon benefited from such forced movements. A great empire takes not only wealth, it also takes people for labor, to fill lands that must be exploited, to weaken the resistance of the place just conquered, to turn military victory into long-term gain. And so, amid the magnificence of the imperial capital, there are always shadowed figures whose story is not told in the language of triumph. They are the quieter part of empire. Those who came to Babylon not as pilgrims or merchants by choice, but as consequences of power. That does not mean Babylon was nothing but cruelty. History is rarely so simple. An empire always possesses the ability both to organize and to impose, both to build and to wound. Babylon was a center where art, architecture, and ritual were elevated to astonishing heights. But precisely because it was a center, it also had to maintain that position through very hard methods. Babylonian power was not a gentle light. It was more like noon sunlight striking fired brick, dazzling, heavy. making everything stand out sharply, yet also making those beneath it feel pressed downward. If you go deeper into the world of the palace, you will feel something else as well. Power is not exercised by soldiers and war alone. It is nourished by image. An imperial king does not merely need to rule. He must be seen as one destined to rule. That is expressed in the scale of buildings, in ritual, in the way the city is rebuilt and renewed under his name, and in the sense that Babylon itself becomes a mirror reflecting the majesty of the king. When kings undertake grand building works, restore walls, enlarge temples, erect new gates, they are not merely answering practical needs. They are speaking to the gods, to their subjects, to their enemies, and to the future, declaring that this power is great enough to leave its mark upon the earth. That is why every brick in those great constructions seems to belong not only to function, but also to memory. A king understands that victory on the battlefield may fade, but a great gate, a new wall, a vast palace, if they continue to stand, will go on speaking for him long after his living voice is gone. Babylon is a place where power learned how to become landscape, not only ruling human beings in the present, but shaping the way they felt the city every day. And once power becomes landscape, it also slips into ordinary life more deeply than one might think. People pass through monuments raised by kings, live under policies they did not choose, dwell in a city whose rhythms of construction, security, taxation, and stability are all tied to the machinery above them. They may never set foot in the great chambers of the palace. Yet the palace enters their lives in quieter ways, through obligation, through fear of war, through the chance of employment when great projects are launched, through the burden of tribute and control. Empire does not exist only in the highest places. It exists in the way this city forces everyone to turn around a center they can never truly touch. There must also have been moments when Babylon felt its power to be nearly unshakable, when the walls stood firm, when streams of wealth continued to flow inward, when rituals still took place, when distant enemies were being subdued, when the king's name rang out beside colossal works. The city may well have believed itself built upon solid ground. But that is a familiar illusion of every empire, for the broader power becomes, the more there is to maintain. The more territories are bound to one center, the more watchful that center must become. The more lands are ruled, the greater the chance of resistance. The more magnificent an empire becomes, the more easily it attracts the ambitions of others. Perhaps that is why, beneath Babylon's confident surface, there must always have lingered a low, enduring layer of anxiety. Not the anxiety of a family over harvest or debt, but the anxiety of a power that knows it stands at a great height and that every height can be watched by others. The walls are not there only for symbol. They are also an admission that the outer world is not gentle. The palace is not there only for display. It is also the place where decisions are made in a land where order must always be held by pressure. The brighter an empire shines, the denser the darkness around it often becomes. When night falls over Babylon's realm of power, the city likely takes on a particular appearance. By day, the palace and great buildings stand in sunlight like declarations. But by night, when the sky darkens and the broad courtyards lie still in shadow. Those same places may become graver, almost heavy. The walls still stand. The gates still close over what they protect. Somewhere, guards remain awake. Somewhere, lamps still burn in areas not yet wholly given over to sleep. Power, unlike the labor of an ordinary day, never sleeps completely. It always keeps watch over its own position. And if you stand in that imagined scene long enough, you will see that the Babylon of power is not entirely the Babylon of the earlier chapters. It is less gentle, less intimate. Yet that is precisely what makes the city more real. For an imperial capital cannot consist only of family meals, sacred rites, or the beauty of architecture. It must also be the place where the fate of other lands is decided. A place where beauty walks beside coercion, where order walks beside latent violence, where the brilliance of the center is purchased by weight scattered outward all around it. If one image must remain after leaving this chapter, perhaps it is the image of Babylon as both radiant and heavy, a city glowing in blue glaze and fired brick. Yet beneath that brightness, an empire is operating through the will to dominate. A palace that is not only a residence, but a place where power is made into solid form. A road that is not only for walking, but for triumphant processions and rituals to declare who stands above. A wall that is not only for protection, but to tell the outer world that this city has no intention of asking permission to keep its place. At this level, Babylon appears as one of the great declarations of ancient history that human beings can gather wealth, gods, law, labor, and war together to create a center so dazzling that centuries later, its name is still spoken. But Babylon also reminds us of something else, something darker and less comfortable, that every beautiful empire has its hidden face. And the closer we move toward the light of power, the more clearly we hear the cost of it echoing upward from beneath the bricks. If, in the earlier parts, Babylon appeared as a city of walls, temples, power, and great orders spread across life, then here we begin to see the people who truly made all of it function. For no city, however magnificent, can live by the idea of itself alone. Babylon could not feed itself on reputation. It could not remember commands on its own, could not carry goods on its own, could not fire bricks, count storehouses, turn earth into jars, fiber into cloth, or speech into wedge-shaped marks that could endure longer than human memory. For so vast a place to go on living from one day to the next, it required countless hands, eyes, and quiet professional habits, patient and enduring. And perhaps, among all those people, the scribe is one of the most remarkable figures of all. Imagine a room not overly large, yet bright enough for the person inside to see clearly the clay surface before him. The air there is not heavy with the smell of hearth smoke or street dust as it is outside. It carries a greater stillness, a deeper concentration, on a low surface like clay tablets still soft. Beside them rests a reed stylus sharpened just right, sharp enough to press cleanly downward, firm enough that the hand may repeat the same motion hundreds of times without faltering. A man, or perhaps a boy still young but already trained long enough, sits leaning forward, wrist steady, eyes following each small mark as it appears beneath the tip. From a distance, that work may seem so quiet as to be almost invisible, but in truth, it is one of the most powerful kinds of labor an ancient city could possess. For the scribe is the one who keeps the city from dissolving into spoken words that pass and disappear. He records the grain brought into storage, records the goods sent out, records promises, distribution orders, the names of those receiving, the names of those delivering, quantities, dates, and all the things a great city cannot entrust to memory alone. In a world without paperwork in the form we know, those small clay tablets were part of Babylon's hard memory. If you move closer, you begin to feel the unique beauty of this profession. It is not loud. It does not carry the straining muscles of those hauling loads, nor the direct heat of a kiln, nor the thick dust of the market. Yet it demands a different kind of endurance, the endurance of precision, the endurance of learning too many signs, too many formulas, too many ways of expression, where even a slight error can shift the meaning in the hand of the scribe. Babylon learns to observe itself. The city knows what it possesses, what it lacks, what it sends out, what it receives, which parts of the machine are functioning well, and which parts might fail if they are not clearly recorded. Perhaps that is why the scribe is not merely someone who knows how to write. He is a link between power, commerce, labor, and memory. Not everyone in Babylon could read what he wrote, yet very many lived inside the reality of what he recorded. A merchant relied upon his inventory lists. A keeper of storehouses relied upon the figures he set down. A laborer might receive a ration already marked out by someone before him. A manager of large building works might issue commands based on what had been counted and confirmed. And so, though he sits still in one room, the scribe is present throughout the city. To become such a person must have required years of study that were anything but easy. Imagine a boy seated in a place of learning from early morning. Before him, model tablets to be copied, columns of signs to be memorized, lists of words, numbers, names of people, names of goods, administrative formulas, all repeated until they cease to be isolated pieces of knowledge and become reflex. Outside, the city remains noisy with trade and physical labor. But inside that room, another kind of labor is taking place. The labor of memory, of discipline, of pressing the human mind into a system tight enough that it may one day serve the entire urban machine. There is something deeply Babylonian in that. This city did not rely only on visible strength. It relied on the ability to organize. And in order to organize, it needed people capable of turning the complexity of life into wedge marks, columns, lists, and order. Perhaps that is also why, when thinking of Babylon, one should not think only of warriors or kings. One should think as well of those who sat in silence with clay tablets before them, because without them, many other parts of the city would have become vaguer, slower, and far more vulnerable to disorder, leaving the world of the scribe. Let us step into places of quicker motion, denser air, where the smells of goods and sweat are sharper. There lies the world of the merchant. Babylon could never have become a great capital if it lived only on what it produced for itself nearby. A city like that required trade. It required flows of goods moving in and out. It required those who knew how to look at an object not merely as matter, but as value, as opportunity, as a point of connection between different lands. Merchants, then, were the people who linked Babylon with the wider world around it. They passed through markets, river landings, storehouses, city gates. They listened for news. They followed prices. They knew what was abundant, what was scarce, what was worth carrying, what ought to be held back, what might bring profit, and what might become a burden if judged poorly. Imagine a merchant on a morning already growing warmer. His clothing may not be as splendid as that of the elite, yet decent enough to show that he is not among the poorest laborers. He walks faster than someone strolling, slower than someone hurrying beneath a heavy load. His eyes are always looking at the quality of a sack of grain, at the way a ceramic vessel has been fired, at the evenness of a woven cloth, at whether the person opposite him seems too eager to sell or still composed enough to bargain. Perhaps his profession does not lie in the strongest hands, but in the ability to judge markets, to judge people, to judge timing. And that is a kind of talent very different from physical labor, though no easier. For in a world where transport is slow, information does not move quickly, and risk may come from weather, roads, thieves, war, or simply changing demand. A merchant lives by the ability to navigate uncertainty. Babylon may be magnificent, but the commerce within it is no natural stream always flowing smoothly. It depends upon many things, and the merchant is the one who must feel that rhythm before it becomes obvious to others. In the market, or the places where goods are exchanged, the merchant's profession shows itself most clearly. They are not always the ones carrying heavy loads on their backs. Often they stand a little apart, speaking less but observing more, negotiating, calculating, setting conditions, waiting for reactions, then shifting their words little by little in order to gain advantage. In a city like Babylon, where goods are not only necessities but the circulating blood of the economy, such exchanges are not small matters. They decide what enters the storehouse, what leaves the city, what remains in the market, and what continues its journey by water, by road, through many hands before reaching its final destination. But goods do not move on their own. And so beneath the scribe and the merchant lies an even broader layer, more numerous, heavier, more demanding still, the workers. Babylon was built by them, not merely in a symbolic way, but almost literally. Think of those who dug earth, kneaded mud, poured it into molds, laid bricks in the sun until they hardened enough to be fired or built with. Think of those who carried loads, tied goods, pulled carts, lifted great jars, moved heavy sacks from one storehouse to another. Think of those who stood before the hot kiln, where heat and smoke wrapped around their faces day after day. Think of those who sat for hours at a loom, hands repeating their motion until it seemed to go on, almost even after the body was tired. Think of those who rowed boats, led animals, repaired tools, split wood, raised frames, sealed walls, mended roofs. Babylon did not possess only a labor force. It possessed an entire ecosystem of labor. What is strange is that, precisely because they were so many and their work so constant. History often glances past them too quickly, but if one pauses long enough, one sees that all the magnificence of Babylon stands upon their shoulders. No matter how beautiful a city wall may be, it still requires people to mix the mud and lay the bricks. No matter how full a storehouse may be, it still requires people to transport and count what is inside. No matter how straight a ceremonial road may run, it still requires people to repair it, sweep it, maintain it. No matter how great a temple may be, it still requires those who build it, those who maintain it, those who carry materials, those who keep it from decaying beneath sun, wind, and time. Try walking through a workshop district at midday. The atmosphere there must have been wholly different from the space of scribal learning or the realm of mercantile negotiation. Here the rhythm is stronger, rougher. There is the sound of hammering, of striking, of heavy breathing, of dragging, of materials scraping against one another. There is the smell of wet earth, of smoke, of sweat, of matter being forced to change its form beneath human hands. Here Babylon ceases to be symbol. It returns to its true substance: earth, water, fire, fiber, wood, metal, and muscle. But these workers did not merely endure, they also possessed skill. We should not see them as a faceless mass who only obeyed commands. A skilled craftsman knows which earth is fit for pottery, which mud is right for brick, what heat will harden material as desired, which fiber will weave into durability, which tool should be repaired, replaced, discarded. Their hands carry knowledge. Even if that knowledge is not always written down, it lives in the body, in sensation, in experience passed from one person to another, from one generation to the next. There are things the scribe may record, but there are also things known only by the hand of the craftsman. And that is one of the most beautiful truths of life in Babylon. This city was sustained not only by the knowledge of writing, but also by the knowledge of craft. One person learned to copy clay tablets through eye and memory. One learned to trade through observation and contact. One learned to craft through hand, back, and the long standing beside someone older. All those paths meet at one point. They create the capacity that allows Babylon to go on living. Perhaps toward late afternoon, when the sunlight is no longer at its harshest, the image of the workers becomes clearer still. They return with dust clinging to their skin, with the smell of the workshop still on them, with bodies bearing the weight of a day's labor. Some may linger longer in the street, exchanging a few words about tomorrow's work. Some hurry more quickly, wishing only to bring their tired bodies back to a small courtyard, to a place of cool water, to the evening meal that awaits. Meanwhile, a scribe may be arranging the day's tablets into order. A merchant may still not be done with his final calculations, weighing which cargo should be held, which payment should be pressed, which journey should be delayed. Babylon at that hour resembles a body with many different rhythms, all slowly quieting, yet none entirely stopping. This helps us understand a truth both simple and profound. A great city does not function through one kind of person alone. It needs those who remember, those who exchange, those who make, those who transport, those who repair, those who count, those who oversee, those who decide, those who carry out. No one among them is enough to create Babylon alone, but remove one link, and the whole network weakens. Without scribes, the order of information begins to blur. Without merchants, the flow of goods clogs. Without workers, every lofty plan remains only a thought that has not yet touched the ground. And perhaps that is why this chapter carries such a particular gentleness, even though it speaks of work, because here Babylon appears less as symbol and more as an immense community of professions, a place where people wake each morning to do their part, not always with the feeling that they stand at the center of history, but simply because the work must be done. An apprentice learning how to keep his hand steady over a clay tablet. A merchant learning how to see hidden value beneath an object's outward form. A craftsman learning how to listen to the way material responds to him. And day after day, it is precisely these highly specialized acts that allow Babylon not only to stand, but to expand, to trade, to remember, and to organize. If one had to preserve a single image after leaving this chapter, perhaps it would be the image of three parallel rhythms existing within the same city, in one place. The sound of a reed stylus pressing into clay in an almost absolute concentration. In another, words of negotiation pushed back and forth between sharp eyes and goods changing value from one moment to the next. And in yet another, the sounds of hammering, pulling, stacking from manual labor continuing on. Heavy and steady as Babylon's own heartbeat. Seen from this layer, Babylon is not only the city of kings and gods, it is the city of people who know how to work, people who know how to write so that memory does not dissolve, how to trade so that goods do not stand still, how to labor so that matter yields to human will. And it is through them that the grandest things in Babylon can continue to exist upon the earth. Day after day, beneath the sun, beneath the dust, beneath the quiet weight of a civilization run by both mind and hand. When Babylon's long day has grown quiet, when the marketplaces have fallen still, when the courtyards within the houses begin to soften into silence, and the heat stored in fired brick is slowly releasing itself back into the air. The city seems to pass into another kind of life. Not the life of bread, of goods, of disputes, of manual labor, but a life wider, quieter, and somehow higher. By day, Babylon belongs to the earth. By night, it begins to belong to the sky. Imagine that at this hour, you are standing upon a high, flat rooftop, or in a broad courtyard where the city walls have broken the wind but cannot block the darkness gradually opening above your head. The city beneath your feet still holds the warmth of the day. The earthen walls retain the heat, as though they were holding the memory of sunlight in the distance. A few late sounds still remain, the closing of a door, the hurried footsteps of someone passing through a narrow lane, the short bark of a dog, and then its silence. The final placement of some household object before an entire home sinks into stillness. But the higher you go, the longer you lift your gaze, the farther those things begin to recede. What starts to take hold of your senses is the Babylonian sky, deep, dark, and dense enough that it almost seems touchable. In a city like Babylon, night is not merely the pause between 2 days of labor. It is a space of observation. It is where people who live among mud earth, river water, war, debt, and ritual lift their heads and search the heavens for an order greater than the one unfolding beneath their feet. And perhaps it is here that Babylon reveals itself in its most mysterious way, and yet also in its truest. For this city does not look at the sky merely to admire it. It looks in order to remember, to compare, to wait for recurring motions, to recognize what arrives in its proper time and what arrives strangely, to ask what those lights above might be saying to the people below. If by day Babylon is a network of streets, storehouses, temples, and palaces, then by night it becomes another network entirely, a network of eyes turned upward, in ordinary houses. Someone may look at the sky only as a habit, to feel whether the night is hot or mild, to guess what tomorrow may bring, to see how far the moon has risen. But in places higher, quieter, tied to temples or learning, there are those who do not look at the heavens as one admires beauty on an evening walk. They look as one reads a text slowly opening before the eyes. Come, follow them. Perhaps it is a stairway leading upward, slow footsteps moving through darkness, a hand carrying a clay tablet, or some simple instrument, or perhaps only a memory disciplined by years of observation. The wind is a little cooler above than it is in the streets below. Not by much, but enough to make one feel that the city at night is slipping free of the weight of the day. Up here, even sounds are different. The thickness of marketplace noise is gone. There is only enough silence for a whisper to be heard clearly. Enough for the movement of cloth in the wind to sound like a gesture of its own. And before them lies a sky full of stars, not washed pale by the lights of the modern world, not hidden behind thick layers of smoke, but an ancient sky appearing almost intact, brilliant in a way only those who lived before electrified streets could truly know. Beneath such a sky, the moon is not merely the moon, it is a rhythm, a marker, something to be watched carefully as it grows full, thins away, disappears, and then returns. The planets are not merely wandering points of light. They are unusual travelers moving among stars that appear still. Some move slowly, some appear and vanish along the bright edge of the horizon. Some require the watcher's patience across many nights before their paths can be understood. And the stars, though more fixed in appearance, still form the background against which all significant movement begins to emerge. There is something profoundly compelling in imagining the people of Babylon standing before the night sky with such concentration. They had no telescope, no printed charts, no intricate metal instruments, no calculating screens. They had only their eyes, their memory, their clay tablets, and a tradition patient enough to turn repeated watching into knowledge. But precisely because of that, their work possessed a beauty all its own. It stood closer to the act of observation itself, more primitive in its material means, perhaps, but deeper in the sense that the human being had to carry the full burden of remembering and comparing by himself. You can almost imagine an observer sitting for a long time in silence, waiting for a bright star to appear in the place where it ought to appear. The night passes slowly, not with the emptiness of time merely dragging on, but with the slowness of something revealing itself if only one is patient enough. That person's eyes have grown accustomed to distinguishing which light is merely part of the sky's stable order, and which light is a noteworthy sign. He knows the passage of the night, knows which part of the heavens will brighten first, which part will sink deepest into darkness, knows when the moon will dim the fainter stars, knows when to look, when to wait, when to record something that may matter, and then, in the midst of that silence, a hand presses wedge-shaped marks into clay once more. That is a very Babylonian moment, the moment when the sky is drawn down toward the earth through writing, when what is vast and distant is pressed into small, orderly marks sufficient to keep collective memory from being lost. A phenomenon in the heavens, if left unrecorded, is merely a single sighting and then nothing more. But once written down, it may be compared with what came before, placed beside other years, judged ordinary or strange, transformed from an isolated experience into part of a wider system of understanding. And it is here that Babylon becomes extraordinary. This city does not merely fear the sky, nor worship it from afar. It observes it with an organized patience. Yet observation in Babylon is never separated from meaning. That is the most important thing to understand if one wishes to truly feel the night of this city. For us today, it is easy to think of astronomy as an effort to understand the universe through the pure laws of physics. But in ancient Babylon, watching the sky was not only a matter of knowing what was moving, it was also a way of understanding what might be foretold. The order of heaven and the order of human life were not two severed worlds. If something unusual appeared above, people below might feel that it touched the fate of the city, of the king, of harvests, of war, of disease, or of great changes not yet made visible. So imagine the night not only with the quiet of the observer, but also with the tension of one listening for a message, an unusual streak of light, a moon suddenly darkened, a planet appearing where it was not expected, something slipping out of its familiar pattern. These things are not looked at with neutral eyes alone. They are placed within a network of meaning, discussed, compared to earlier records, understood as signs that require interpretation. And it is precisely this interweaving of careful observation and the longing to find omens that gives Babylonian night both the quality of knowledge and the quality of reverence. Perhaps nowhere is that more beautiful than on the thin moon nights at the beginning of the month, or on nights when the moonlight is just bright enough for the city to take shape while the sky still remains deep. From above, Babylon is not ablaze with light. It lies in patches of darkness, rooftops, courtyards, passageways, walls, empty spaces between buildings. All emerge only faintly beneath the gentle light. A few small lamps here and there are not enough to defeat the darkness, only enough to give it more depth. Temples and great structures become dark and solemn silhouettes. The palace is quieter than it is by day, but none the less heavy in its presence. And above it all, the heavens open like a dark sea strewn with cold, enduring lights. In such a scene, Babylon suddenly ceases to be merely a center of land and power. It becomes a small point lying beneath an order far vaster than itself. And perhaps it was precisely that feeling which made the Babylonians both humble and eager to understand. For no matter how great their city, how high the gates, how tall the ziggurat, how vast the temples, the sky remained greater still. Every earthly authority, placed beneath the stars, becomes more fragile. Perhaps that is why night is the time when those who live at the center of power, like Babylon, most easily feel that they do not truly command the world. They are only trying to read a small part of it. Babylonian night also holds different layers of human life beneath the same sky. In a small house, a child may lie listening as an older voice tells something about the stars, not fully understanding, but remembering forever the feeling that there is a world beyond, very far away. One people always speak of in softer tones. In another courtyard, a mother may lift her eyes to the moon with a very earthly worry over whether there will be enough food tomorrow, yet inwardly still feel the moon as something more familiar and enduring than all her anxieties. On a higher roof, an observer continues his work, not looking toward his personal fate, but toward signs for the whole city. All these layers of life exist within the same night, beneath the same vault of heaven, and yet each person reads darkness and light in a different way. That is what makes Babylon beneath the night sky so captivating. It is not a still picture. It is many kinds of silence layered upon one another. The silence of the laborer finally at rest, the silence of the temple after ritual, the tense silence of those watching the heavens, the silence of the city knowing that even if it may command the streets by day, by night it must still listen to something greater than itself. And then there are special nights, nights when the sky refuses to remain merely the familiar sky. A lunar eclipse, for example. Imagine the shiver passing through Babylon as the bright moon slowly darkens, as though some invisible hand were covering it. No one would need to explain at length for the city to feel that something was not ordinary. The observer above would surely grow more intent, filled with wonder, hurriedly recording, and aware that what he is witnessing will not end as a beautiful spectacle merely remembered. It will be read, thought over, drawn into the world of prediction and apprehension in such moments. Heaven and earth seem to draw nearer to one another. The atmosphere of the city itself may change because of a strange darkness creeping across the moon. But Babylon does not live by wonder alone. After wonder comes discipline. After astonishment comes the act of recording. After the question comes comparison with what came before, and it is precisely there that this city becomes so memorable. It does not look upon the sky like someone wholly carried away by mystery. It looks with a sternness almost severe in its persistence. Night after night, month after month, life after life. Each small observation may not say much by itself, but many generations added together transform the sky from a curtain of untouchable things into a realm with rhythm, with traces, with patterns waiting to be recognized. You can almost see it in the image of clay tablets being stacked away after the long night. The hand has grown tired. The eyes are strained from staring into darkness. The rare chill before dawn is passing over the skin. The east is beginning to pale ever so faintly, and among the fresh wedge marks, still damp, there is proof that Babylon has not slept completely. While many rooftops have already sunk into silence, somewhere there are still those keeping watch over the sky's memory on behalf of the city. As dawn approaches, there comes a very beautiful moment. The stars begin to fade, not suddenly, but as though withdrawing step by step into the distance. The earth is still dark, but no longer as deep as at the beginning of the night. The birds have not yet fully begun to sing. The city is still suspended in the softest interval between night and day. And perhaps it is precisely then that the watcher of the heavens feels most clearly that his work belongs to a strange boundary. He does not belong wholly to the night, because what he does will be carried back to the writing table, the temple, and the decisions of the day. But neither does he belong wholly to the day, because his knowledge can only be born in darkness, in the hours when most of the city is asleep. Perhaps that is why this chapter carries such a distinct color in the story of Babylon. By day, the city may impress people with its scale and organization, but by night, it reveals a deeper part of its soul, the longing to find order within the infinite. The Babylonians did not merely build walls upon the earth. They also tried to build invisible bridges between their fragile lives and the enduring motions of the sky above. They looked at stars, at the moon, at wandering planets, not merely to know where those bodies were, but to know where human beings themselves stood within a world far greater than their own. And if one had to keep a final image for this chapter, perhaps it would be the image of Babylon lying still beneath the night sky, flat roofs sunken into shadow, temples standing like solemn dark masses, a few small lamps still burning, and above them ancient lights continuing along their path. Somewhere within the city, a scribe of the heavens is still bent over a clay tablet. Somewhere else, a family sleeps peacefully beneath that same vault of sky. And the whole of Babylon, with all its gates, palaces, debts, gods, wars, and labors, lies beneath a vastness so immense that everything human beings have built suddenly seems small. And yet it is precisely in that smallness that this city becomes most unforgettable. For Babylon beneath the night sky is not merely a city looking up at the stars. It is a city that learned how to listen to darkness, record light, and search in those distant motions for an answer to its own deeply human unease. A city that knew the heavens do not speak in an easy language, and yet remained patient enough to sit through the entire night reading one sign after another. And in that patience, amid the night wind, the warm brick, the clay tablet, and the stars that never cease their journey, Babylon becomes one of the most beautiful places human beings have ever built in order to face the universe. And then, after all that has been passed through, after the great gates, the ceremonial roads, the sunlit courtyards, the clay tablets that preserved human promises, the temples heavy with incense, the palaces of power, and the high rooftops from which people lifted their eyes to the night sky, the final question arrives at last, very softly, yet unavoidably. How does a city like Babylon come to an end? Not in imagination, where everything usually collapses in one violent instant, as though a single great sound were enough for history to close. Reality is almost never that simple. Great cities rarely vanish in a single day. They do not go out like a lamp being blown out. They fade. They change hands. They lose breath. They continue living for a while longer under another form, another role, another rhythm, until suddenly people realize that the place which had once been the center of the world for so many generations no longer held that heart within it. Babylon was like that too. If one stood in the midst of its greatest age of splendor, it would have been difficult to believe that this city would one day retreat into shadow. Everything here was built to resist that feeling of fragility. Thick walls, great gates, monumental temples, long, straight avenues that seemed to cut directly into the future. Even the way Babylon saw itself seemed to leave no room for smallness. It was a capital, a place where the gods were exalted, the center of power, a city others mentioned with caution, wonder, or bitterness. To those who lived within it, such a place must have seemed as though it would always remain. But history cares very little for human feelings of permanence. Empires change hands. Lands once held under control begin to lean elsewhere. New powers rise beyond the horizon. Lines of power shift. New centers appear. And then, at some point, Babylon is no longer the hand holding the surrounding world in its grasp. It becomes something held by others. Imagine a day when news no longer comes to Babylon as reports of victory or commands sent outward, but as waves of unease returning against the current. Rumors, faces graver than usual, more guarded conversations behind thick walls. Out there, another power is drawing near, not like a passing gust of wind, but like a force slowly causing every old certainty to waver. The city is still there, the temples still stand, the markets still open, bread is still baked, yet something in the air has changed. A sense that the order which once seemed so secure it needed no questioning has suddenly begun to question itself. Then the conquest comes. But here, the most striking thing is not a simple scene of ruin. Babylon does not turn to ashes at once. That is what makes its story sadder, but also truer. The city is entered by a new power, placed beneath a new order, compelled to go on existing while knowing that it is no longer the self-determining center of its own life. And sometimes, that is the deepest kind of decline, not to die at once, but to go on living, to go on standing, to let people still pass through the old streets, while the heartbeat no longer lies within one's own chest. Perhaps if you pass through Babylon in the years after the conquest, you would not yet see any abrupt difference on the surface. The great structures would still be there. The temples would not yet have disappeared. The inhabitants would still live. Trade, pray, raise children, write, and lift their eyes to the night sky. A great city cannot cease to be a city simply because the holder of power has changed. But what changes first, perhaps, lies in its invisible position. Babylon is no longer the place from which the main rhythm of empire is sent forth as before. It is still important, but no longer in the old way. It is still looked toward, but the gaze has changed. No longer the gaze lifted toward an absolute center, but the gaze cast upon a place now enclosed within someone else's network. And that is how many cities begin to grow old, not by vanishing from the map, but by slowly losing the role that once made the map turn around them. And then time continues on, as it always does, indifferent to the splendor any generation once believed sufficient to save itself from oblivion. Other dynasties follow. New ambitions pass through this land. New rulers wish to touch Babylon, to dwell within it, to use its great shadow to illuminate their own power. At certain moments, the city is noticed again, preserved again, placed within larger designs once more. But it is no longer revival in the old sense. It is like an old body still dressed in beautiful garments, still retaining its form in certain eyes, while the life within no longer burns as it once did. Perhaps one of the saddest things about Babylon's decline is that it did not lose everything at once. It lost itself piece by piece. A road once full of ritual may still remain, but it is no longer walked with the same meaning. A temple may still stand, but the prayers within it no longer carry their former place in the order of the world. A district once at the center of imperial decision may still be used, but the greatest command is now given from somewhere else. A city like that does not lose only matter. It loses gravity. And when a city loses gravity, everything begins to drift slowly away from it. People may not leave at once. Houses may not yet collapse. Clay tablets may still be written. Those who watch the heavens may still look upward according to old patterns. That is precisely what makes Babylon remarkable, even in decline. It does not cease to be a place of knowledge simply because power has left its hands. It does not cease to be a place of memory simply because empire has changed masters. Babylon prolongs its life in texts, in ritual, in habit, far longer than the brightest phase of its political glory. But even those things cannot prevail forever against the greater current of history. As new centers are built, as trade routes shift, as political life seeks other footholds, Babylon gradually becomes heavy with its own past. It is too large to disappear all at once, yet it is also too bound to a vanished age to continue as the proper shape of the future. And so, little by little, the pulse of life thins. Areas within the city may become more sparse. Great structures grow harder to maintain with the same care as before. Wind, sand, rare rain, long sunlight, and the indifference of generations who no longer need the place in the old way begin to do the work that armies or politics never fully accomplished. They allow Babylon to grow quiet. If you were to stand there in a much later age, the feeling would likely be strange. Spaces once built for grand processions now carry a different kind of emptiness. The walls still remain, but no longer face the same world. The great gates no longer open to the same kind of wonder. The masses of architecture that once forced the eye upward now begin to belong more to silence than to power. And it is precisely that contrast which makes Babylon's decline more than a historical event. It becomes a feeling. The feeling that what was once the center has now become part of the earth's memory. But this is not yet Babylon's true ending. For there are cities that die in matter, but live on in memory more tenaciously than any city still standing. Babylon is such a city, when its real power has passed away. The name Babylon begins another life, the life of a symbol. It enters religious memory, It enters legend. It enters the imagination of those who have never seen it. It enters stories in which it appears as the image of proud power, overwhelming wealth, empire, decadence, order, chaos. Depending on the eyes of the teller, Babylon gradually becomes more than a real city. It becomes a name capable of holding too many meanings at once. And that is something strange indeed. For while the real bricks of the plain slowly sink beneath dust and wild grass, Babylon in the human mind grows wider by the day. Someone living far away in time or distance may still speak of Babylon as a symbol without ever needing to touch a single one of its bricks. A city that no longer retains its real empire gains another empire instead. The empire of memory. Within that empire, Babylon is no longer tightly bound to the historical form of each dynasty. It may appear as the place of towers rising into the sky, as the city of wondrous gardens that later ages never cease imagining, as the emblem of excessive power and excessive pride, as the memory of a civilization that knew how to write, how to watch the stars, how to raise temples and build laws. Every age looks into Babylon and sees something of itself reflected there. Perhaps that is the strangest legacy a city can leave behind. Not only what it once was, but also all the things later humanity needs it to represent. And then, across so many centuries, dust resumes its quiet work. The remnants of Babylon lie there beneath the fierce sun and dry wind of the Iraqi plain, with no more sound of markets, no more ritual processions, no more voices reading clay tablets in a schoolroom, no more pounding footsteps of empire. Only the ground remains, the brick foundations, the traces of walls, the empty spaces through which an outsider may walk and hear nothing, unless he knows how to listen. But the past, especially the past of Babylon, rarely consents to remain entirely silent. And then one day in the modern world, human beings begin to dig downward, begin to read again, begin to fit the scattered fragments of a city long asleep into a new story. The bricks, the reliefs, the gates, the clay tablets, the temple foundations, the lines of writing that seemed meaningless to so many generations, begin little by little to speak again. Babylon, a city that first lived through power and then through myth, now lives yet again through archaeology and the curiosity of the modern age. There is something deeply moving in that a place once made so silent by time can return, not as an empire, but as restored memory. Modern people come to Babylon not to offer tribute, not to wait for commands, not to attend Marduk's New Year rite. They come to understand, to look at a brick foundation and imagine the vanished height above it, to look at fragments of blue glaze and imagine how the gates once blazed beneath the sun, to hold a small clay tablet and realize that there was once a time when an entire city entrusted its memory to the earth. And at that very moment, Babylon appears in a gentler way than it did when it was still the center of power. It no longer threatens anyone, no longer conquers anyone, no longer forces other lands to bow. It lies still, like a great lesson in history, yet speaks in no raised voice, only through broken brick, through foundations, through emptiness, through a name that continues to live stubbornly in human memory. Babylon now makes people not only marvel, but also reflect. For when one stands before the ruins of a place that once believed itself at the center of the world, one can hardly avoid thinking of the fragility of every human power ever built. Perhaps that is what lingers longest after this journey. Not merely how great Babylon once was, how rich it was, or how fearsome, but that a city can pass through so many forms within one long life. From a rising city beside the Euphrates, into a capital of law, temple, and empire, into a place where people recorded debts, married, prayed, and watched the stars, then into part of another empire, then gradually into a place growing quiet beneath dust, then again into a symbol in religion, legend, and memory, and finally into an archaeological site, where modern people walk through and try to piece together the sound of a lost world. Babylon declined, but it did not disappear in the ordinary way. It passed from matter into symbol, from power into memory, from the present into history. And perhaps that is why it proved more enduring than many empires that once believed themselves invincible. If one had to preserve a final image for this chapter, perhaps it would be the image of dusk falling over the ruins of Babylon. No more ritual processions, no more banners of victory, no more sounds of palace or marketplace. Only late sunlight falling on old brick, wind moving through spaces that were once walls, and somewhere within that silence, the feeling that this city has not entirely departed. It is still there, not as a living power, but as a memory too vast for time to bury completely. And so Babylon closes not with one single sound of collapse, but with a long, deep settling, full of aftertones. A city that once wished to touch eternity in the end did not escape the fate of every human construction. Yet in the moment when bricks broke, empires changed hands, and the ceremonial road lost its old procession. Babylon attained another kind of endurance. No longer the city of yesterday, but the city of human memory. And then, after all that has been passed through, after the great gates, the ceremonial roads, the sunlit courtyards, the clay tablets that preserved human promises, the temples heavy with incense, the palaces of power, and the high rooftops from which people lifted their eyes to the night sky, the final question arrives at last, very softly, yet unavoidably. How does a city like Babylon come to an end? Not in imagination, where everything usually collapses in one violent instant, as though a single great sound were enough for history to close. Reality is almost never that simple. Great cities rarely vanish in a single day. They do not go out like a lamp being blown out. They fade, they change hands, they lose breath. They continue living for a while longer under another form, another role, another rhythm, until suddenly people realize that the place which had once been the center of the world for so many generations no longer held that heart within it. Babylon was like that too. If one stood in the midst of its greatest age of splendor, it would have been difficult to believe that this city would one day retreat into shadow. Everything here was built to resist that feeling of fragility. Thick walls, great gates, monumental temples, long, straight avenues that seemed to cut directly into the future. Even the way Babylon saw itself seemed to leave no room for smallness. It was a capital, a place where the gods were exalted, the center of power, a city others mentioned with caution, wonder, or bitterness to those who lived within it. Such a place must have seemed as though it would always remain. But history cares very little for human feelings of permanence. Empires change hands. Lands once held under control begin to lean elsewhere. New powers rise beyond the horizon. Lines of power shift. New centers appear. And then, at some point, Babylon is no longer the hand holding the surrounding world in its grasp. It becomes something held by others. Imagine a day when news no longer comes to Babylon as reports of victory or commands sent outward, but as waves of unease returning against the current. Rumors, faces graver than usual, more guarded conversations behind thick walls. Out there, another power is drawing near, not like a passing gust of wind, but like a force slowly causing every old certainty to waver. The city is still there. The temples still stand. The markets still open. Bread is still baked. Yet something in the air has changed. A sense that the order, which once seemed so secure, it needed no questioning, has suddenly begun to question itself. Then the conquest comes. But here, the most striking thing is not a simple scene of ruin. Babylon does not turn to ashes at once. That is what makes its story sadder, but also truer. The city is entered by a new power, placed beneath a new order, compelled to go on existing while knowing that it is no longer the self-determining center of its own life. And sometimes, that is the deepest kind of decline, not to die at once, but to go on living, to go on standing, to let people still pass through the old streets, while the heartbeat no longer lies within one's own chest. Perhaps if you pass through Babylon in the years after the conquest, you would not yet see any abrupt difference on the surface. The great structures would still be there. The temples would not yet have disappeared. The inhabitants would still live, trade, pray, raise children, write, and lift their eyes to the night sky. A great city cannot cease to be a city simply because the holder of power has changed. But what changes first, perhaps, lies in its invisible position. Babylon is no longer the place from which the main rhythm of empire is sent forth as before. It is still important, but no longer in the old way. It is still looked toward. But the gaze has changed. No longer the gaze lifted toward an absolute center, but the gaze cast upon a place now enclosed within someone else's network. And that is how many cities begin to grow old. Not by vanishing from the map, but by slowly losing the role that once made the map turn around them. And then time continues on, as it always does, indifferent to the splendor any generation once believed sufficient to save itself from oblivion. Other dynasties follow. New ambitions pass through this land. New rulers wish to touch Babylon, to dwell within it, to use its great shadow to illuminate their own power. At certain moments, the city is noticed again, preserved again, placed within larger designs once more. But it is no longer revival in the old sense. It is like an old body still dressed in beautiful garments, still retaining its form in certain eyes, while the life within no longer burns as it once did. Perhaps one of the saddest things about Babylon's decline is that it did not lose everything at once. It lost itself piece by piece. A road once full of ritual may still remain, but it is no longer walked with the same meaning. A temple may still stand, but the prayers within it no longer carry their former place in the order of the world. A district, once at the center of imperial decision, may still be used, but the greatest command is now given from somewhere else. A city like that does not lose only matter, it loses gravity. And when a city loses gravity, everything begins to drift slowly away from it. People may not leave at once, houses may not yet collapse, clay tablets may still be written, those who watch the heavens may still look upward according to old patterns. That is precisely what makes Babylon remarkable, even in decline. It does not cease to be a place of knowledge simply because power has left its hands. It does not cease to be a place of memory simply because empire has changed masters. Babylon prolongs its life in texts, in ritual, in habit, far longer than the brightest phase of its political glory. But even those things cannot prevail forever against the greater current of history. As new centers are built, as trade routes shift, as political life seeks other footholds, Babylon gradually becomes heavy with its own past. It is too large to disappear all at once, yet it is also too bound to a vanished age to continue as the proper shape of the future. And so, little by little, the pulse of life thins. Areas within the city may become more sparse. Great structures grow harder to maintain with the same care as before. Wind, sand, rare rain, long sunlight, and the indifference of generations who no longer need the place in the old way begin to do the work that armies or politics never fully accomplished. They allow Babylon to grow quiet. If you were to stand there in a much later age, the feeling would likely be strange. Spaces once built for grand processions now carry a different kind of emptiness. The walls still remain, but no longer face the same world. The great gates no longer open to the same kind of wonder. The masses of architecture that once forced the eye upward now begin to belong more to silence than to power. And it is precisely that contrast which makes Babylon's decline more than a historical event. It becomes a feeling. The feeling that what was once the center has now become part of the earth's memory. But this is not yet Babylon's true ending. For there are cities that die in matter, but live on in memory more tenaciously than any city still standing. Babylon is such a city, when its real power has passed away. The name Babylon begins another life, the life of a symbol. It enters religious memory, it enters legend, it enters the imagination of those who have never seen it. It enters stories in which it appears as the image of proud power. Overwhelming wealth, empire, decadence, order, chaos. Depending on the eyes of the teller, Babylon gradually becomes more than a real city. It becomes a name capable of holding too many meanings at once. And that is something strange indeed. For while the real bricks of the plain slowly sink beneath dust and wild grass, Babylon, in the human mind, grows wider by the day. Someone living far away in time or distance may still speak of Babylon as a symbol without ever needing to touch a single one of its bricks. A city that no longer retains its real empire gains another empire instead. The empire of memory. Within that empire, Babylon is no longer tightly bound to the historical form of each dynasty. It may appear as the place of towers rising into the sky, as the city of wondrous gardens that later ages never cease imagining, as the emblem of excessive power and excessive pride, as the memory of a civilization that knew how to write, how to watch the stars, how to raise temples and build laws. Every age looks into Babylon and sees something of itself reflected there. Perhaps that is the strangest legacy a city can leave behind. Not only what it once was, but also all the things later humanity needs it to represent. And then, across so many centuries, dust resumes its quiet work. The remnants of Babylon lie there beneath the fierce sun and dry wind of the Iraqi plain, with no more sound of markets, no more ritual processions, no more voices reading clay tablets in a schoolroom, no more pounding footsteps of empire. Only the ground remains, the brick foundations, the traces of walls, the empty spaces through which an outsider may walk and hear nothing, unless he knows how to listen. But the past, especially the past of Babylon, rarely consents to remain entirely silent. And then one day in the modern world, human beings begin to dig downward, begin to read again, begin to fit the scattered fragments of a city long asleep into a new story. The bricks, the reliefs, the gates, the clay tablets, the temple foundations, the lines of writing that seemed meaningless to so many generations, begin little by little to speak again. Babylon, a city that first lived through power and then through myth, now lives yet again through archaeology and the curiosity of the modern age. There is something deeply moving in that a place once made so silent by time can return, not as an empire, but as restored memory. Modern people come to Babylon not to offer tribute, not to wait for commands, not to attend Marduk's New Year rite. They come to understand, to look at a brick foundation and imagine the vanished height above it, to look at fragments of blue glaze and imagine how the gates once blazed beneath the sun, to hold a small clay tablet and realize that there was once a time when an entire city entrusted its memory to the earth. And at that very moment, Babylon appears in a gentler way than it did when it was still the center of power. It no longer threatens anyone, no longer conquers anyone, no longer forces other lands to bow. It lies still like a great lesson in history, yet speaks in no raised voice, only through broken brick, through foundations, through emptiness, through a name that continues to live stubbornly in human memory. Babylon now makes people not only marvel, but also reflect. For when one stands before the ruins of a place that once believed itself at the center of the world, one can hardly avoid thinking of the fragility of every human power ever built. Perhaps that is what lingers longest after this journey. Not merely how great Babylon once was, how rich it was, or how fearsome, but that a city can pass through so many forms within one long life, from a rising city beside the Euphrates, into a capital of law, temple, and empire, into a place where people recorded debts, married, prayed, and watched the stars, then into part of another empire, then gradually into a place growing quiet beneath dust, then again into a symbol in religion, legend, and memory, and finally into an archaeological site, where modern people walk through and try to piece together the sound of a lost world. Babylon declined, but it did not disappear in the ordinary way. It passed from matter into symbol, from power into memory, from the present into history. And perhaps that is why it proved more enduring than many empires that once believed themselves invincible. If one had to preserve a final image for this chapter, perhaps it would be the image of dusk falling over the ruins of Babylon. No more ritual processions. No more banners of victory. No more sounds of palace or marketplace. Only late sunlight falling on old brick. Wind moving through spaces that were once walls. And somewhere within that silence, the feeling that this city has not entirely departed. It is still there, not as a living power, but as a memory too vast for time to bury completely. And so Babylon closes not with one single sound of collapse, but with a long, deep settling, full of aftertones. A city that once wished to touch eternity in the end did not escape the fate of every human construction. Yet in the moment when bricks broke, empires changed hands, and the ceremonial road lost its old procession, Babylon attained another kind of endurance. No longer the city of yesterday, but the city of human memory. Tonight, we have passed through towering gates and ceremonial roads gleaming with brilliant glazed color. We have stepped into ordinary homes, stood in the middle of bustling marketplaces, and seen bread, beer, clay, river water, debt, family, temples, and the quiet people who kept a great city alive from one day to the next. We have seen that Babylon revealed itself not only in the splendor of kings, but also in the hands of craftsmen, on the debt tablets of merchants, in the prayers of priests, and in the eyes of those who watched the night sky, trying to find the order of the universe above their heads. And perhaps what lingers longest is not only the image of an ancient city, but the feeling that even across thousands of years, those people still lived among things deeply familiar to us: labor, anxiety, hope, faith, kinship, and the desire to leave some trace of themselves against the passing of time. If you are still here with me in these final moments, leave a small comment and tell me where you would like us to go in the nights ahead. Would you like to listen to the story of life in ancient Egypt, the roads of Rome, the temples and myths of Mesopotamia, or another ancient city that once blazed with light and then fell silent? And if you love history told in this slow, reflective way, do not forget to subscribe to the channel and follow the fan page so you will not miss the journeys still to come. And now, let Babylon slowly dissolve into the darkness and carry you with it into a peaceful sleep.